So there's really no time for the chair, but I just wanted to say that Hani Babu was my colleague at EFL University. In fact, we were in the same department, sharing the office space when he joined, and later we became very close friends because we were working as part of the Teachers Association. So I was the vice president, and he was the general secretary. I think also one of the beginnings of his uh, kind of political activity in IFLU. And from then on, I think we have been very close friends. And one thing that really bothered me and his family and friends is that why someone like Babu was picked up. Because even before he went to Mumbai the previous day, I was talking to him. Then I was saying that he will not be arrested. I mean, what are the reasons for that? So simply for being a teacher, simply for being a sincere teacher, for being a secular, rational person, a honest person, a committed individual who is trying to do his job, and like all other teachers in this country, college teachers and university teachers who try to also speak for others, your colleagues, maybe some other poor people and some other issues, and thinking that there is a constitution. And Babu was greatly inspired by the constitution and the rules and regulations. Is meticulous in looking at rules and regulations, asking them to be implemented and so on. So he was highly, greatly kind of influenced by this. But for him, I think, so the only crime is that he tried to be a good teacher, a genuine, honest teacher. He tried to be an honest citizen of this country. And that country, that democracy is now infected with Pegasus. So that virus is destroying democracy. Now we know why Babu and people like Babu, a good teacher, a good advocate, a good poet, a good writer, will be in prison. So with this, I will briefly introduce Nivedita. There is a formal kind of small bio. I'll read that. Nivedita Menon, professor at Center for Comparative Politics and Political Theory, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, is the author of Seeing Like a Feminist. Apart from research papers in Indian and international journals, her previous books are Recovering Subversion, Feminist Politics Beyond Dila, 2004, and the co-authored Power and Contestation, India After 1989. She also has two edited volumes, Gender and Politics in India, 1999, and Sexualities, 2007, and a co-edited book, Critical Studies in Politics, Exploring Sites, Selves, Power, 2013. She is a regular commentator on contemporary issues on the collective blog, Kafila.online, of which she is one of the founders, and active in democratic politics in India. She also has translated fiction and non-fiction from Hindi and Malayalam into English, and from Malayalam into Hindi, and received the A.K. Ramanujan Award for Translation instituted by Katha. And in fact, I would add one line by saying that she's one of the outspoken critiques of the political regime in this country. And she's bold, she's courageous, she's taken difficult positions on many issues of this society. And now I request Nivedita to speak.
Thank you, Satya. Let me begin by dedicating this lecture to Hani Babu, fellow scholar, fellow teacher, fellow traveler in the journey towards the horizon of democracy and justice, imprisoned on fabricated evidence by the vicious authoritarian regime we are ruled by currently. I salute the courage and determination of his family, and I salute to the rest of the Bhima Koregaon 16. Above all, Father Stan Swami, judicially murdered by the Indian state, who served his Lord by serving the Adivasis amongst whom he lived. I also want to honor the names of the others in prison on these charges. Anand Teltumde, Shoma Sen, Mahesh Raut, Varavara Rao, Sudhir Dhavle, Surendra Gadling, Sudha Bharadwaj, Gautam Navlakha, Rona Wilson, Arun Ferreira, Vernon Gonsalves, Sagar Gorkhe, Ramesh Ghaichod, and Jyoti Jagtap. We know now that planted fake documents form the core of the NIA's case against these academics, writers, poets, lawyers, and cultural activists. The current regime stands completely unmasked by the independent digital forensics firm, Arsenal, that has now released more damning evidence of long-distance tampering with the laptops of these individuals who were arrested under the UAPA on the sole basis of these concocted documents. This evening, I'm here in solidarity with them and with the hundreds of thousands all over the country who reject the politics of Hindu Rashtra and of rampant corporate capitalism. Our collective struggle against all forms of injustice will continue and will not end with the certain defeat of this regime. My lecture today in honor of Hani Babu is a series of reflections on translation, on all communication being a form of translation, and what the implications of this recognition are for knowledge production. Translation as paradigmatic of any conversation and every act of translation as shot through with power relations. This understanding is now very much a part of a certain common sense arising from a formidable body of scholarship. One point of departure from here is in the direction of seeing translation as a hermeneutic project of understanding, an ethical project of destabilizing the self through engagement with the other. Another direction could be in that of recognizing the constitutive misreading underlying any project of translation. Today, assuming and taking on board much of this work, I would like to reflect particularly on a third aspect of translation as a project of rendering intelligible. What are the limits to this project? Who seeks intelligibility? Who evades it or simply in daily quotidian ways bypasses its operation? Is the quest for mutual intelligibility implicit in all social interaction? But more critically, is this very assumption of the possibility of mutual intelligibility complicit in projects of power? So what I plan to do for one large part of the paper is to consider critically a text generally accepted to be an illustration of radical pedagogy, The Ignorant Schoolmaster by the French philosopher Jacques Rancière, which from the perspective of the global South and for me seems curiously innocent about the drive of assimilative power. The text valorizes education as learning to enter a settled universe. Later, we will compare it to Paulo Freire's model of subversive pedagogy, which sees knowledge as dynamic and unsettled. In The Ignorant Schoolmaster, Rancière writes about, I think someone's mic on?
Yeah, I have taken care of that. You can please continue.
Thanks, sorry. So in The Ignorant Schoolmaster, Rancière writes about Joseph Jacotot, a school teacher driven into exile during the period of monarchical restoration in France in the early 19th century, who developed a method of showing illiterate parents how they could themselves teach their children to read. This text is universally read as a radical reworking of traditional pedagogy, but I find it deeply conservative and problematic. Jacotot, landing up with a job in a Flemish-speaking part of Belgium, had to teach children who spoke no French while he spoke no Flemish. He tried an experiment with a recently published bilingual edition of Homer in French and Flemish. He asked his students through an interpreter to learn on their own the French text with the help of the Flemish translation. After some time, he asked them to write about the text in French, and he was astonished to find they could do so as well as French students could have done. He had not taught them the first elements of French, neither spelling or grammar. The students had looked for the French words that corresponded to words that they knew in Flemish and figured out the grammar by themselves. Thus, says Rancière, in the mind of Joseph Jacotot, a sudden illumination brutally highlighted what is blindly taken for granted in any system of education, the necessity of explication. So Rancière asks, why should one mind explicate a text to another mind? Why couldn't the student figure out what the text meant with her own mind? And yet the method he proposed of an individual learning something without having it explained to her is, Rancière says, the oldest in the world. Everyone has learned something in this way at some point in their lives. But, he says, the social circle, the order of things, prevents it from being recognized for what it is, the true method by which everyone learns. So this is an intellectual revolution, is what he says. So the pedagogical problem is to reveal an intelligence to itself. This is the way Rancière puts it. Anything can be used, a song, a prayer that the student knows by heart. There's always something the student knows that can be used as a point of comparison. The teacher's two fundamental tasks then are interrogation. He demands speech, the manifestation of an intelligence that was not aware of itself, and verification, that the work is done with attention. To do this, a highly skilled teacher is not required and is even a liability, because his knowledge discreetly leads the students to the right answer rather than allowing their own intelligence to do the work. The Jacotot method, thus, the method of the ignorant schoolmaster, says Rancière, differs from that of the Socratic master, because through his interrogations, Socrates leads the slave to recognize the mathematical truths that lie within himself. This may be the path to learning, says Rancière, but it's not a path to emancipation. So this is what he calls universal teaching, in which equality is not a goal to be attained, but is assumed as a starting point. Anyone is capable of grasping the most difficult of ideas, since the same intelligence is at work in all human endeavor. Now, it's very obvious that this is a kind of radical pedagogy of which we can immediately see the progressive potential, but it seems to me that it addresses only one kind of knowledge and one kind of learning. That is, its radicalism lies in using one's own intelligence rather than that of a teacher to enter into an existing body of knowledge with its own established rules, to learn how to do X. But what if one thinks of knowledges as having to be subverted, of existing knowledges as embodying dominant discourses of power? Then the point would not be only to learn the rules well, but to subvert them, to constitute new bodies of knowledge and counter selves. For instance, Rancière does not explicitly consider the politics of the gradual eradication of Flemish by the French nation state in the making, so that it would always be Flemish speakers having to learn French rather than vice versa. He does not consider the ways in which modernity in general introduced standardized forms of organizing time and space, maps, calendars, that did considerable violence to the peasant knowledges it was still replacing in Jacotot's time. Thus, Rancière Jacotot says that the locksmith, for example, who does not know the alphabet, can look at a calendar. Doesn't he know the order of the months? And can't he thus figure out January, February, March? He knows that February has only 28 days. He sees that one column is shorter than the others, and he will recognize 28. However, the Gregorian calendar that Rancière takes for granted has nothing to do with the natural cycles by which peasants live. And illiterate people have to learn to read the calendar as much as they have to learn to read the alphabet. It's not a knowledge that is inborn or naturally imbibed in all words and contexts, even in the 20th century. This way of learning appears to be about learning to enter and negotiate existing formations of knowledge. In addition, Rancière uncritically reproduces Jacotot's argument that universal teaching belongs to the family. And here family is opposed to society, which exemplifies social order. Thus, in Jacotot's understanding, the social order requires citizens produced by society and schooling, but men are produced in the sanctuary of the family, where the father was the supreme arbiter, and it was there and there alone that intellectual emancipation can be fruitfully sown. In short, Rancière Jacotot's critique of social order only leads to the family as the place of self-education, the family whose core, as we know, is patriarchy, compulsory heterosexuality, the very basis of unequal property relations, whose main function is the reproduction of traditional values. Thus, our suspicion that Jacotot's understanding only results in teaching oneself how to immerse ourselves in existing knowledge formations, setting apart and delegitimizing the knowledges that one already has. It appears that this is what is the project. It is useful here to consider an argument made by Peter Winch, who, writing about the relationship between language and reality, makes a distinction between two kinds of languages. One is a set of linguistic conventions, such as English, French, and so on. When one knows one language of this sort and wants to learn another, one remains within the same world. learning English names for the objects and experiences one already knows in French. So for instance, when one learns to command, say in English, to say do this, one is not learning to command per se. One is learning how to perform an action one already knows in another language. But the second kind of difference between languages that Winch would like us to keep in mind is produced by the different worldviews they are called upon to express. This is the difference between, say, the language of science, modernity on the one hand, and those of other worldviews. Winch uses the example of the magic practices of a tribe called the Azande. When one learns mathematics or science, those languages express an entirely different worldview from magic or religion. They give expression to a set of beliefs that can be expressed in no other language, just as magic cannot be expressed in the language of science. Learning to prove something mathematically is not simply learning a new way of expressing something I already know in another language. I am learning a new action that can only be performed in that language. The reason Jacoto's method requires no teacher or the ignorant teacher is that Rancière sees education, in Winch's first sense of language, as simply learning to do in a new language what you already know in another, when in fact modern education is about remaking the self altogether. Jacoto's peasant students must translate their experiences into a language that expresses another reality, a new world. Their own experiences acquire a new life and meaning, or may in fact lose their meaning by being rendered intelligible in the new language. Their own worldview becomes superstition or culture as opposed to universal scientific fact. The calendar can teach you numbers and the alphabet only because all of these are part of the new world in which you must learn to live, setting aside knowledges you already possess. Contrast this to Brazilian scholar activist Paulo Freire's famous Pedagogy of the Oppressed, in which knowledge and learning is a process of mutual translation. He calls it problem-posing education, in which no one teaches another, but nor is anyone self-taught. So there is the idea of new knowledge, but there is new knowledge on both sides. So through dialogue, he calls them the teacher of students and students of the teacher cease to exist, and the teacher-student and student-teachers emerge. That is teacher-student and student-teachers. They become jointly responsible for a process in which they all grow. Thus, while Freire too gives up on the idea of the all-knowing teacher, he does not give up on the idea of a teacher altogether. It seems to me that the term teacher in this kind of understanding, in Paulo Freire's kind of understanding, is the entry of the outside into one's world, destabilizing its codes of meaning, its common sense, and its order. In this sense, the students are the outside of the teacher's world and she of theirs. The teacher knows 10 things her students do not know, but they know 10 things she doesn't, as Freire finds when he plays a game with the peasants group he is visiting, in which they ask him 10 questions. What's soil liming? What is green fertilizer? And he asks them 10 questions. What's an intransitive verb? What's epistemology? The translation in Freire then involves a mutual flow of intelligibility and potential misreadings that could be productive. And now consider the story of the birth of a new language, which linguists would be familiar with, a story that raises significant questions for our understanding of how bodies of knowledge are formed and transformed. After the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua in 1979, for the first time in its history, a huge nationwide effort was made to educate deaf children. Hundreds of deaf students were enrolled in 2 schools. They had never been introduced to any of the world's existing sign language systems and came to the schools with only the simplest kinds of gestural signs that they had developed within their families. Their teachers were new and inexperienced and found it difficult to communicate with their students. But the students themselves had no problem at all in communicating with one another. With great rapidity, they began to build on the common pool of signs, and a complex new language began to emerge, which has now come to be called Nicaraguan Sign Language. Some years down the line, an even more interesting development was noticed. As younger children entered the school system, they not only picked up the language their seniors had developed, but they confidently began to break the existing language rules. They invented new signs, they deformed old ones, and these new signs that did not obey the old rules filtered back into the language, making it more complex, richer, and more varied. The development of NSL obviously raises all kinds of issues for scholars of sign language and linguisticians generally. That's not my field, but I was struck by a different kind of question. Does the continuing development of NSL tell us something about how knowledge is created and how shared bodies of knowledge are transformed? In this era of exclusive and limiting rights in intellectual property, in which we live under the crushing myth of either the solitary individual producing knowledge in isolation or of the corporation inventing knowledge from scratch in its laboratories, it's worth recognizing a simple truth underscored by the story of NSL, that human beings produce knowledge by coming together in groups of different sorts, and that all knowledge is always situated in an extensive pre-existing field. More importantly, it's the younger members, the newer entrants to a community that make the breakthroughs that lead to new kinds of knowledges. They very rapidly learn what the seniors of the community have developed painfully over the years, and then take that body of knowledge in new and unimagined directions. But what really leaps out from this story is that knowledge develops when rules are broken. The faithful following of old rules keeps the body of knowledge safe and pure and sterile. It's the breaking of rules that permit uncharted directions, fresh insights, productive mistakes. The language that develops from rule breaking reveals an entirely new world. A further point that is actually relevant to note here is that there's something crucial about sign as such, sign language as such, something linguists are more familiar with, but not so most of us who are hearing. And this is the fact that sign, with a capital S, because it's a language like any other, is not a straightforward translation of spoken and written words into signs. Sign is a unique independent language in 4 dimensions. Speech has only 1 dimension, its extension in time. Writing has 2 dimensions, but sign fully uses the dimension of space as well. It is the linguistic use of space. And the eye that is illiterate in sign cannot even see, let alone understand, the intricacies of its spatial patterns. Scholars of sign say that sign is essentially cinematic. In it, narrative is not linear. In William Stokoe's words, the essence of sign language is to cut from a normal view to a close-up to a distant shot, including flashback and flash-forward scenes. I bring up this understanding of sign to further complicate the idea of translation and intelligibility, particularly about the direction that translation is assumed to take, which is rendering intelligible languages of the powerless in the language of the powerful. This is essentially the pressure to be intelligible in global and transnational spaces. And I put both global and transnational in quotation marks because both the terms usually refer to the global north, to be intelligible in those spaces. Let me now attempt to bring together the larger point about translation I hope to make here. All too often, global and transnational spaces are the brave new world in which all heterogeneity is rendered transparent to the global cosmopolitan imagination. The pressure to be intelligible in cosmopolitan terms is always expressed benignly in an inviting tone. It is an invitation to the Enlightenment, no less. More than half a century of critique of this project later, we see it animated anew in the 21st century under the sign of global public sphere, global left, cosmopolitanism, and so on. So you have, for example, Habermas, who counterposes to the imperialist agenda of the United States of America the idea of a world citizenship based on a European vision, which he sees as very different. There could be a world citizenship based on this vision. And he says the European vision of enforcement of a politics of human rights aimed at establishing the rule of law in international relations. However, from the perspective of the global South, in an unequally structured global economy, the distinction between US hegemony and European hegemony with regards to a politics of enforcing human rights does not appear to me to be a significant one. One of the qualities of a distinctively European as opposed to an American public sphere, according to Habermas, is secularism in politics. And I quote him, citizens here in Europe regard transgressions of the border between politics and religion with suspicion, unquote. But this unproblematic definition of secularism begs the question of Europe's internal other, Islam. The controversy over the French state's attitude to the headscarf, what was termed conspicuous religious symbols in schools, surely has produced discussion of sufficient complexity to counter Habermas's simple assertion that citizens in Europe regard transgressions of the border between politics and religion with suspicion. Disagreement over what exactly constituted the transgression of that border. Was it the state's banning of religious symbols, or was it citizens' wearing of them? Was precisely at the heart of the controversy. Moreover, it was apparent that the category of citizen was internally split. The question of which groups of citizens objected and to what brought every tension in the classic European conception of secularism into focus. Or take Susan Buckmore's, whose conception of a global public sphere, while recognizing that it is marked by contradictions and lack of mutual comprehension, still asserts we exist in the same discursive space. I quote Buckmore. It is precisely this assertion that performatively produces homogeneity out of a radical heterogeneity. Buckmore, in an attempt at developing mutual comprehension, argues that any ethical project of political translation should mutually open up languages, but her understanding is still fixed within what Naoki Sakai terms a homolingual mode of address. In Sakai's sense, translation needs to be a heterolingual mode of address, which assumes, quote, a non-aggregate community of foreigners, unquote, as opposed to a homolingual address that assumes the normalcy of reciprocal and transparent communication in a homogeneous medium. In a heterolingual mode of address, the addressee could respond with varying degrees of comprehension, including missing the signification completely. The heterolingual address thus assumes that every utterance can fail to communicate because heterogeneity is inherent in every medium and therefore translation is endless. Buckmore, on the other hand, like other philosophers in this mode, assumes that all thought can be rendered into modes familiar to the cosmopolitan intellectual. Thus, she asks, for example, so I'll give you one example, and these are clearly the more sort of generous, progressive attempts to communicate and translate and so on. So the assumption that all thought can be rendered into modes familiar to the cosmopolitan intellectual. So she asks this question: why do some activists and philosophers use the notion of Islamic economy? This, according to her, takes the easy way of identity politics, I quote her, defining itself as an economy belonging exclusively to Muslims, if those scholars and activists would consider the global anti-capitalism movement as the most authentic, I mean, they could do this, that those who talk of the Islamic economy could consider the global anti-capitalism movement as the most authentic contemporary political expression of Islamic principles. So why call it Islamic economy? Why take the easy way out of identity politics? Why not link with the global anti-capitalism movement? Because it actually expresses the essence of Islamic principles. This is her question. Now, of course, it should occur to one, is it possible that this question can be posed the other way around even? Is it even coherent to imagine a question posed like this? Why cannot the anti-capitalism movement recognize that Islamism is today the most authentically anti-capitalist philosophy available and consider itself part of global political Islam? This question is unimaginable. We cannot even imagine posing it like this. Consider also this astonishing assertion that Buckmore makes, and I quote Buckmore now: if we are interested in the genealogy of a global public sphere, we will need to note that the first radically cosmopolitan critique of Western-centric thought did not come to the Islamic world from within. It came from French-speaking Caribbean via secular Marxist transport with a detour to Algeria, and when it appeared, it came with a Western wrapping. I'm referring to Frantz Fanon's remarkable book, The Wretched of the Earth, which, paradoxically introduced by the European Marxist Jean-Paul Sartre, called on the non-Western world to leave Europe behind, unquote. With the qualifying phrase radically cosmopolitan emphasized by her in italics, Buckmos is able to dismiss all previous and future debates on Euro or West centrism in Islamic thought as parochial. In her view, then, 19th century Egyptian thinker, the modernist Muhammad Abduh, to cite just one random instance, who responded to European ascendance through the revitalization of Islam as the religion of reason, can only be seen as asserting a parochial particular identity. But more crucially, the simultaneous rendering of Fanon as cosmopolitan in Buckmos's terms, that is, as bearing no identity but that of the secular Marxist, is equally untenable. The Fanon who came hygienically packaged in Sartre's introduction is not the Fanon from The Fact of Blackness, the essay translated misleadingly as The Fact of Blackness, who celebrates his blackness and the explosive solidarities produced by the poets of negritude. Buckmos, in effect, denies the Fanon who cries out at Sartre's betrayal in Orphée Noire, his essay introducing a collection of poetry from Francophone Africa, in which Fanon says, Sartre aridly intellectualizes the experience of being Black. Sartre presented negritude as, Fanon puts it, a minor term of a dialectical progression, as merely a transitory stage on the way towards the universal and abstract class identity. When I read that page, says Fanon, I felt as if I had been robbed of my last chance. Jean-Paul Sartre had forgotten that the Negro suffers in his body quite differently from the white man, unquote. The idea that something called identity politics exists in contrast to another politics that is universal is, of course, the classic act of power, as universalism is simply a particularism that claims universality. Not to mention the problematic assumption that it is somehow the easy way out, as Buckmos puts it, to assert identity. Referring to the famous incident of the Haitian revolutionaries singing the Marseillaise, Zizek says the message of it was this: we are more French than you, the Frenchmen. We stand for the innermost consequences of your revolutionary ideology. Zizek adds that if we imagine a situation in which those confronting the US Army might sing the Stars and Stripes, there would be nothing a priori problematic in doing so. Of course, the problem precisely is that those confronting the US Army today refuse the Universal Emancipatory Project, refuse to claim ownership of the Stars and Stripes. The Haitian claim to the emancipatory French heritage was certainly a deeply unsettling message to send the colonizers. But historically, another response to colonialism has been the repudiation of the Western heritage as flawed, not just contingently flawed, but constitutively flawed. But Zizek's Kant, for instance, is forever the pure philosopher of universality, even as he draws Kant's legacy directly from Christianity and St. Paul. Christianity can claim the universal status denied to Islam, Judaism, or Hinduism. And of course, what about Kant, the anthropologist, the first systematic theorist of race with his taxonomy of hierarchically ordered racial difference? That Kant we will never encounter in philosophy classes. We will inevitably and always have to discover that Kant through African and Caribbean scholarship, through Emmanuel Chukwudi Eze or Walter Mignolo. We will have to recognize that there are ongoing conversations in different publics in their own terms, in diverse languages, in both the senses that Winch outlines. To be prepared to overhear these conversations with the certainty that we will not necessarily immediately, perhaps never, understand what is at stake, to resist the temptation to translate the unfamiliar into the familiar. An instance of such engagement is the work of Benno Glauser, the scholar activist who has worked with indigenous peoples in Latin America for over 3 decades. He says, when talking to indigenous peoples, we communicate with a radically diverse realm. The two paradigms are essentially incommensurable. He's also talking of the social science paradigm. He finally had to recognize that it was an absurd pretension to think that he could write about his conversations with them in methodological terms acceptable to the academy. I quote him, we discover that speaking to indigenous peoples forces us to abandon our own method, unquote. In this, our 21st century world, there is a radical heterogeneity of voices in public spaces, which we cannot help colliding with and cannot hope to contain. All thought, all practice does not inhabit the same discursive universe, and the modernist conceit that everybody seeks to be understood by a cosmopolitan public sphere and can in fact be thus understood, far from being an expression of equality and democracy, can be an act of violent appropriation.
Yeah, over. Finished?
Sorry, I finished. Thank you. I'm
Yeah, thank you,
Yeah,
Nivedita.
yeah, we're
Yeah.
finished in
yes.
good time actually. So we have about 13 minutes to 6, but we can take another 7 minutes in the next session. So 20 minutes now for the.
So there are some questions in the chat box. I can
Yeah,
see.
so please, I think I request all the audience to type in their questions and Nivedita will answer.
Yeah.
She'll take up 2, 3 and answer, and then next 2, 3.
Yeah,
Nivedita,
Nivedita,
first.
are you
Okay, I
able
can.
to? Yes. Can you look
Sorry,
at
yes,
the?
I can see a question here. I can't make out who it's from, but here goes 2 points. Who's this? I wonder.
It's Tanmay. It's Tanmay.
Okay, Tanmay. Okay. So shall I just read out the question? One?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so 2 points. Breaking of rules in recreating a more enriching SL is partly true for spoken language as well. Take, for example, mixed codes, which the older generations are always wary of, or black vernacular English, but depends on what is meant by rules. For example, in these examples, mixed codes or BVE, grammatical rules are not broken. Secondly, however, the larger issue is whether these kind of so-called rule breaking in language has anything to do with breaking rules of social norms. I think that's a much more difficult connection to make. What do you think? Thank you. Yes. I'm trying to keep before us the question of language in both senses continuously. That is, language in the sense of I mean, English, French, Hindi, languages and linguistic conventions. That's one kind of language where we apparently occupy the same world and learn to express emotions we already share and actions we already understand in another language. But there's the other meaning of language as well, or the other sense in which one chooses language. And I'd like to keep that before us as well, where you have to know the language to express anything at all relevant to that world which the language sets up. For example, mathematics is a good example, right? So how much does the breaking of rules of grammar have to do with breaking rules of social norms? I think it's not necessarily the case that the breaking of rules of grammar leads to or assumes the breaking of social norms, but the chances are quite high that when one insists on a language that is not the hegemonic, mainstream, accepted, correct language, when one insists on that, there is a very strong possibility that that is because there's another universe that lies behind, which is not made visible if certain grammatical rules are followed. So I would think that the chances are that they could be would be linked, and we would have to obviously do this on a case-by-case basis. We would have to see whether the breaking of the rules is leading to the breaking of social norms. I was trying to make a larger metaphorical point. So, for example, in Nicaraguan Sign Language, perhaps no social norms were being broken, but it would be interesting to study what linguists have to say and whether in fact social norms were broken. I think we would have to do that on a case-by-case basis. That's the only question in the chat box so far.
Yes, I'm also monitoring the YouTube comment for the live stream, so I don't see any questions there, but I'll relay them as I see them. I do have a question if I can ask.
Yeah.
So you talked about the exchange of ideas during certain revolutions that have happened, like the Haitian Revolution you were talking about, and you talked about the ideas that the Haitian people claimed to took away from the colonialism. For example, their values, for example, and this, as you said, and they said they are more French. My question is like in with respect to all these sort of revolutions against colonialism, what determines that what ideas are kept and what ideas are hated upon by a particular revolution, if that makes sense?
You, I think if we start with the assumption of radical heterogeneity, we would understand there cannot be one answer to that question. So the kind of modernity that is decried by, let's say, traditional elites let's say in the context of India, is precisely what non-elite, subalterns, Dalits, etc., seize upon, right? That what is called derisively or what is critically called colonial modernity, and one has a critique of that colonial modernity. But if one doesn't understand that colonial modernity did not affect every section of society in the same way, then we would look for one answer. So I think when you ask the question, what determines what will be seized upon and what will not be, then I think we're really talking about doing granular work on particular histories. I don't think we can make abstract formulations. We would have to look at specific context. But in general, I would imagine that there's always the potential there was the potential for, let's say, very specifically the ideals of the French Revolution, right? There was the potential for it to be used, which is why the Haitians sang the Marseillaise. But eventually, we know what French colonialism really was, brutal, etc. So I think we would have to, I think we have to start with the assumption of radical heterogeneity and study specific context.
Okay. Oh, thank you so much.
I can see now some questions have come here. If you can, I thought I saw some more questions. Yeah, no, wait. Vyom, if you can. Rule breaking has many parts. Okay, this is this Gita?
Gita,
yeah, okay. Rule breaking has, I'm sorry, Vyom, can you read it?
Sure.
Please read it because it's going too fast.
Gita asked, it's a comment, I'm not sure. The rule breaking has many parts. The retaining of syntactic structure of one's language while allowing the import of words from other languages, which then acquire value as suffixes or prefixes, like the way the term super has been adopted to signify measure, and not in the sense it is used in English. Does that make sense?
That seems more like is that more like a comment?
Yeah, right. Yes.
And also rule breaking apropos Dalit literature, for example, rather than retain the standard written form or the evolved standard spoken form, they substituted local usage particular to specific geographies, communities, and this became a way of doing fiction that is as much autoethnography in a collective and linguistic sense. For instance, a novel about fisher life had to have an entire word list towards the end, interestingly. Though all of this was accommodated within an expansive and putative Tamil linguistic history. Yes, I can well see that. I understand that. I think these are very interesting comments. I just take it as enriching the discussion. I don't think.
Joya just has a question that is there a digital version of this paper we can read? Not all can watch the names and authors and from Panon.
I will just write just Susan Buckmore is who I was talking about. Yeah, I suppose one could share a digital version at some point. Okay, so another question. You put it very well when you said universalism is simply another particularism that claims universality. Here, is it useful to distinguish modernity's project of drawing an Archimedean point for cultures from the project of Chomskyan linguistics? Or do you consider the latter to be a manifestation of the former? Is it useful to distinguish modernity's project? I'm not able to address this question only because I am not really familiar with Chomskyan linguistics. I am familiar with Chomsky's political writings. And so I'm not going to be able to actually address this question at all. So I don't actually know. It would be good if maybe if you could, Anjali, if you could maybe just write a few lines whether you think the two are different. I'm not in a position to answer that question. It might be useful to
Anjali,
make a distinction.
if you can raise your hand, so I will allow you to
Okay, so Anjali is
open
saying
your.
Chomsky linguistics is an idea of universal grammar. Yes, perhaps if you could ask Anjali, perhaps you could just explain since we have time. It might be useful to make a distinction between norms, conventions, and rules, both in the context of languages and society. Okay, her audio is bad, but I'm getting it. So if it's an idea of universal grammar, look, okay, so let me enter from the point of what I do know a little bit about, which is having recently read Oliver Sacks on sign language. Now, Oliver Sacks arrives at a conclusion. I'm sure this is hugely debated in the field of linguistics. So please understand I'm making no claims. I'm just terrified I'm stepping into a minefield. But I'm not sure still what, if the idea of a universal grammar as hardwired, let's say, if that's what you're referring to, and if that's what Chomsky linguistics refers to, I won't comment on that, but I will comment on what Oliver Sacks said about sign. And what he said about sign is that they found, and perhaps you're familiar with this, and I'm very sorry if I sound like I'm the equivalent of mansplaining to you, something that you're very familiar with, but this is what I do know and what I can speak about in response to your question. What I understand Oliver Sacks to be saying is that when in the study of sign, what they found was that the use of sign transforms the structures and use of the brain. Parts of the brain that are given over to hearing become transformed into visual media and so on. So what Oliver Sacks argues. So what Oliver Sacks argues is that there possibly is no hardwire. That language, so it seems, at least with reference to sign, he's saying this. But I would actually, so it seems at least that there is one kind of language that isn't hardwired. Let me put it that way. Sign is not hardwired. It's not a universal grammar. It's a completely different form of communication. It's not translating our words into signs. It's a completely different mode. It's visual, it's spatial, it has a fourth dimension. Now, if that is the case with even one language, what does it imply? And in any case, I don't think that even if we were to accept a universal grammar, we would necessarily have to accept universalism philosophically. I don't think we would have to accept that. I don't think that follows. We also see a manipulation of existing grammatical rules in the Hijra-Koti code spoken in various parts of the subcontinent, especially in Hindi-speaking areas. So social gender is encoded by manipulating the rules of use of grammatical gender in Hindi. That and a set of secret words from the community together from the language they speak, known as Farsi. Yes, so this is very interesting and useful. I take it as a comment. Apropos what Ritesh says, the rules of language are tacit. In the Chomskyan sense, they don't exist in the social minds of speakers, which only know socially prescriptive grammar. Nivi Sacks is wrong, okay? Maybe I'm reading him wrong. So I did say I don't want to enter specific questions about linguistics. I want to hold on to the idea of rule breaking. I want to use the experience of what happened with Nicaraguan Sign Language to think about knowledge as such and all communication as a mode of all communication as modes of translation. So if one thinks about language in that sense, there is the possibility that translation inevitably means the translation of languages of the powerless to the languages of the powerful. And what I tried to show in my paper was that if we were to resist that, we might be resisting, in some senses, the idea of perfect communication. If we take the idea of the heterolingual address, for example, of Naoki Sakai seriously, we are resisting the idea of perfect communication. So, I think we would have to, I think that's the point that I would prefer to hold on to rather than enter into very specific debates within linguistics. Could I ask a question too complicated to type? Is that Aisha?
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, so my question is like this. So what value do we put on rule breaking? So I just want to work with a concrete example. So we know that the modern standard Hindi, which is the cross-fertilization of a Fort William project in the 1870s and the Central Hindi Commission in the 1950s, right? The rules that it broke against, if you want, in terms of substitution of lexical items, they couldn't do very much with the syntax, but and the language that is now the Indian language that is spoken, the language of modern Hindi that is spoken at particularly this moment, as it's a system of breaking of rules. There have been periodic resistances against it. So with Hindustani, in fact, it was Aaj Tak and News Track that brought spoken Hindustani Hindi back into the circulation. So how much do we see the radical heterogeneity? What is its memory bank? Because today, of course, all rebellions against modern standard Hindi, which has amassed a lot of power to itself in the last 50 to 70 years, but it had no power. It revolted against a language which was, 100 years ago was not this at all. So in itself, what value do you think that it has? Let's forget about the, UG-based questions of language, because the differences are minor. And that's why linguists call it Hindi Urdu, because we really don't see such a huge difference in the syntax. But in terms of their social value and what it signifies, and now it increasingly signifies a politics which is a Hindutva politics, to speak, say Adhik instead of Zyada, etc. So those lexical items have a value. Now that's a change. That's a breaking of the rules of what was in the 90s a leher. So what value do you think that just in itself we get? Is this change something that you can, I don't
Well,
know.
rule breaking is not in and of itself necessarily productive of a more just or transformative world. I think that should be very clear, because rule breaking is also the Trump supporters storming the Capitol or the demolition of the Babri Masjid, right? So these are also breaking of rules. But I think the point I'm making is not that rule breaking is necessarily productive of justice, but that it is productive of something, of new forms of knowledge, and all new forms of knowledge are not necessarily, again, what we might want to subscribe to. So I think that is the uncomfortable thing about democracy, that we cannot predict in advance whether a move will be socially transformative in the direction of justice or in the direction of injustice. But it does produce new worlds. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I think we're living in a completely different world today than we imagined possible in our wildest dreams.
Right.
So I think that that's really the point that I would like to. There's a question
Nivedita,
to you.
there are some questions from YouTube as well. Would you
Okay,
like
can
to
I
take
just
them?
say that, Aisha, there's a question from Aditya.
I'll reply to him. You carry on with the YouTube question.
Okay, so the YouTube question.
Yeah. So the first question is, would you consider identity politics as something that makes the exploited more vulnerable?
No. See, I have a problem with the term identity politics. I don't ever use it myself. I used it I was quoting Buck Moss using it. Because what is identity politics? Or let me put it this way, what is not identity politics? What is not identity politics? Really, right? So usually when the term identity politics is used, it's used pejoratively. And it is used to describe a kind of politics that is somehow moving away from something that is more universal, more inclusive, and going into like a small self-determined little space, etc. But I would say that all politics of this kind is identity politics, because one mobilizes oneself in terms of, let's say, class. For me, that's an identity. I think to identify yourself as a worker is not something that then obliterates all your other identities. At some point, you are interpellated, right? To use the Althusserian term, you're interpellated as a worker in the context of, let's say, a massive struggle, but a massive worker struggle, and you produce yourself as a worker, and then you might get drawn into politics in which your Dalit identity counts. You might get drawn, in fact, in that same space, your Dalit identity might count, or your Muslim identity might count, because the struggle doesn't, somehow the struggle throws up leaders who are all Savarna Hindus, let's say, men, right? So suddenly those other identities. So I don't actually think that identity politics leaves anyone. I mean, I don't think that, for me, that question cannot be posed in that way, because I don't think there is any politics that is not identity.
All right. So there's just 1 minute left, and I will just club the two questions, and maybe you can answer them in short. In modernist construction, heterogeneity is seen as multiculturalism. How to deal with this? And then the other question is,
okay, let me just answer that very quickly, because it will be difficult if the second question is not related.
Right.
So so the problem with the multiculturalism framework is that it assumes homogeneous stable cultures, and the idea is that all those homogeneous stable cultures should have space within a polity. So in fact, multiculturalism's notion of heterogeneity is limited to separating different cultures from each other, but there is no understanding that those cultures are not sealed hermetic units. There is no understanding that within those cultures there's heterogeneity. So Hindu culture is casteist. So if you look at the big debates in the US over textbooks, school textbooks, and the discussion of caste, one of the arguments that those who oppose the introduction of caste discrimination as a topic of study in Hinduism is that this makes Hinduism look bad among the other cultures, and it permits racism against Hindus. This is the kind of argument that is being made, and that becomes possible because Hinduism is being seen as they want to present Hinduism as the only difference vis-a-vis other, and not any internal differences. Sorry. So so multiculturalism is quite problematic.
So it's 6:11 now. If Satya sir, so there was one more question. I hope Indrani can ask the question to the speaker at some point. So should we move on, Satya sir?
Yes, I think I will have to close because already 6:12. So thank you, Nivedita, for the insightful presentation and also the solidarity